Hi, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner. Welcome to tonight's edition of The Robust Opposition. We have a really good and important show for you tonight because we're going to be talking about net neutrality and Trump's FCC chief's released plans to repeal net neutrality. With me are my two guests, Craig Aaron, who is the head of Free Press, which is the preeminent media reform organization in the country, in my opinion, and Eleanor Goldfield, who is an activist with popularresistance.org. She also hosts her own show called Act Out on Free Speech TV. Welcome to The Robust Opposition, you guys.
Thanks for having me.
So, Craig, let's start with you. Net neutrality, paid prioritization, blocking, throttling, Title II, all these kind of wonkish terms have been thrown around. So for people who aren't familiar with net neutrality, I just say we have to save the internet. We have to keep it free and open. Maybe you can explain a little bit about what net neutrality means, the history of it, and why it is so important.
Yeah, well, net neutrality is kind of a wonky term, but it just means no discrimination. It means when you go online, you should be able to go wherever you want, do whatever you want, download whatever you want, and it's not up to your phone or cable company to decide which websites and services are going to work and which won't. And it is net neutrality. Sometimes we call it the First Amendment of the internet because it is this sort of even playing field created by net neutrality that allows so many things to prosper and thrive online. So net neutrality supports free expression. Net neutrality is essential if you're talking about using the internet to organize. And if you're organizing in these days, pretty much you're using the internet, at least as part of your strategy. Net neutrality is key for innovation. It's what makes it so that somebody with a good idea can compete with the biggest companies, the most powerful corporations. If they've got something important to say, they can find an audience. And we've been fighting in Washington and really at this point all across the country, now going back to 2005, 2006, over how these terms are going to be defined and whether the Federal Communications Commission is actually going to have the authority, the power, and the political will to actually step in when a big company like Verizon or Comcast or AT&T decides to start messing with your internet connection. There have been a couple different chapters in this fight. The one that I guess I like to talk about the most is in 2014 and 2015, we put a lot of pressure on the Obama administration, which was trying to pass off sort of a fake half-measure version of net neutrality and got them to completely reverse course with an incredible amount of public pressure, millions and millions of people contacting the FCC, and actually passed the strongest rules and really clear support for net neutrality and restored the agency's authority, which had been taken away during the Bush years, to actually step in when there's a problem. Now here we are in the Trump administration, and they're trying to take all that away.
Yes, I wanted to go back to 2014 because that's when I first became involved in the issue. There was a big coalition, and I was sort of the LA point person for all the direct actions. I remember organizing 4, maybe even 5 actions here in Los Angeles. One of them was with Mary Alice Krim from your organization, Craig, and it was Obama in the back seat because he had made a statement during his campaign that he would take a back seat to no one in terms of protecting net neutrality. And then when it was time for him to actually do it and tell his FCC chief, Tom Wheeler, to reclassify it under Title II of the Federal Communications Act, he didn't do it. And then the other one that I did was a Occupy the FCC solidarity rally at their regional office in Cerritos. Now that was based on an action that Eleanor, you were involved in with popularresistance.org, where you actually occupied the FCC headquarters in Washington, D.C. Can you talk about that, please?
Yeah, so I wasn't personally there, but Popular Resistance, the organization that I'm working with, occupied the FCC as part of their direct action list that they did, which included occupying Chairman Wheeler, who was the chairman of the FCC at the time, which included blockading his driveway and not allowing him to get to work. It also included actions like a dance party outside the FCC to raise awareness for net neutrality. And the occupation of the FCC was really interesting because a lot of it included direct interaction with people who worked at the FCC. So it really included trying to empower the employees who work there to push their own chairpersons to fight for net neutrality and, as Craig mentioned, to protect the free and open internet and keep it accessible to all the people who use it.
Now, we had during the summer, I guess it was the internet slowdown, and you said we did it again this summer, where we had so many different websites basically put a message on their, well, why don't you describe, Craig, what the internet slowdown was and how far-reaching that effort was, how many different types of websites participated, and how effective you think it was?
Sure. I mean, I think all these series of sort of escalating protests with a mix of online and off has been really key to the success of this campaign, now going on a number of years. So when Popular Resistance decided to occupy the FCC, a lot of the groups that, were sort of used to lawyering and lobbying and things were like, oh, I don't know if that's a good idea. What are people going to think? But what was so great about that protest was that, most people that work at the FCC don't think anybody knows that they exist. And so for there to be tents outside, propped up outside the FCC and people showing up day after day, suddenly everybody started to say, like, what are we doing? Are we doing something wrong? No one's ever been here before. And that's kind of one of the things about campaigning around the FCC. And so that went on. And of course, this being about internet freedom and internet openness, one of the key things was to mobilize the internet and actually get the internet active on this. And, that had happened a couple times in smaller ways. But as we rounded in to 2014, and this is before President Obama, this is sort of after the protest you were talking about, Lauren, which I believe was at some dinners where some people, sort of internet company people sidled up to the president. And, he sort of said, aren't we doing such a great job? And they were kind of like, well, actually, no, you're sort of killing the internet. And got his attention. But then we did this huge internet slowdown, and there were, hundreds of thousands of websites participating, including some of the biggest sites on the internet. Interestingly, for something like this, this is actually driven grassroots up, not the other way around. So you had activists like our allies at Fight for the Future actually calling on these companies to come out and participate, put something on their platform, send a message. And there was a huge response. Back in September 14, 2 million people contacted the FCC in a single day.
Yeah.
And the FCC had never seen anything like that before. The most comments they'd ever gotten on anything was, during Janet Jackson's Super Bowl mishap. And then all of a sudden, here comes net neutrality, and people are really serious. There's all this pressure. And it started to become a political issue, and it really started to move the FCC. By the end of that year, they had completely reversed course. President Obama, who once upon a time had been a big advocate for net neutrality, 6 years into his term, came out very strongly for what I would call real net neutrality. The FCC had been going through their own process. They realized the sort of half measure they were doing was never going to stand up in court. They got on board, and all of a sudden you had an FCC meeting in February of 2015, which was interrupted by 7 standing ovations. Now, a couple months before, Kevin and Margaret from Popular Resistance were literally being tackled and thrown out of the FCC for lifting a banner. You fast forward 4 or 5 months later, and you've got Tom Wheeler himself, a former cable industry lobbyist, proudly standing up and calling it the proudest public policy day of his life.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, doing protests on that subject back in 2014, I saw people come out that were not the protesting type. They weren't the usual suspects for the other types of protests I've been involved in and other issues since Occupy. I mean, we had small business owners that were out there talking about how their business would be harmed if they didn't have a free and open internet. We had gamers talking about how their local games they would have to pay more for. We had all sorts of artists that weren't necessarily political. Now, you're an artist yourself, Eleanor, and that's how I met you. Rooftop Revolutionaries was the name of your band. How did you first become involved in the issue of net neutrality, and why is it important to you?
Well, To answer that question, I'd first like to talk about the thing that Craig just mentioned, because the person speaking at that event where Margaret and Kevin were tackled, which I was also at, was Ajit Pai. He was on the board then at the FCC, and he was giving a talk about why he didn't like net neutrality when Wheeler was still the FCC chairman. And the banner that Margaret and Kevin were trying to unfurl said that 80% of Republican voters want net neutrality. And that's still the case. I mean, this is not a partisan issue. If you ask a Republican, a libertarian, et cetera, whether they'd like an accessible internet, of course the answer is yes, because our lives take place in a digital realm at this particular point in time. So it's really important that people recognize that this is not a lefty issue. This is, you know, as the UN put it, access to internet is a human right at this particular point in time. And I think as an artist, I recognize that too, because we live our lives in the digital realm in terms of promoting our work as artists. And without access to the internet, you can't promote anything. You know, you can't promote your show. I can't promote my show. People can't promote the creations that they make, whether that be Etsy or whether that be music. We really live our lives in this digital realm. And as an artist, as an organizer, as a journalist, it's impossible for me to do what I do without open access to the internet, because I don't have corporate backing. I don't have friends at Verizon like Ajit Pai, who used to work there. I don't have the ability to call them up and say, hey, could you open up the toll road for me? I'd like to get through. And that's what we're looking at without net neutrality, is toll roads and the blocking of websites and the blocking of access to the internet.
Now, before we get into his particular rules, which he unveiled today, let's talk about Ajit Pai, because a lot of people have been writing on Facebook today that we shouldn't forget the fact that he was appointed by Obama, this former Verizon employee, executive, attorney, whatever he was. And this is not a Democrat-Republican thing, because now we have this guy in charge of the FCC and trying to take away what we all worked so hard for. So maybe you can talk, Craig, about this guy. Did you expect, before you saw these rules, did you expect them to be like this? And expound on some of the things in the Mashable article that people have been sharing as to why this is even worse than we had expected.
Sure. Well, I think we knew it was going to be bad. And yes, Ajit Pai was appointed in the Obama administration. But of course, the way the FCC works is that there are essentially whoever's in the White House gets 3 seats and the opposition party gets 2 seats. And he was one of the Republican appointees. He's a former Sam Brownback staffer. He's a former Jeff Sessions aide. He's a lovely guy all around. And the story with Ajit Pai is, you know, and somewhat different than the way others have run this agency. The FCC has long been a captured agency. Like, this is a place where big phone and cable companies, broadcasters, media powers got very used to calling the shots. And, you know, it's filled with people who are, the revolving door at the FCC is as bad as it is anywhere, with staffers and commissioners, you know, going in and out between industry and, you know, even in the Obama administration. I mean, Obama nominated the former head of the cable lobby. He ended up doing a good job under a lot of pressure, but he was the former head of the cable lobby. And while he was the head of the FCC, the head of the cable lobby, and still is, was the former chair of the FCC. So that's the kind of place we're talking about. It's a lot of corporate control and corporate capture. And Ajit Pai comes out of that environment, but he had been he'd been an FCC staffer, he'd been a congressional staffer, sort of a consummate DC insider. But now that he's gotten the chairmanship, he has taken the job even farther to the right and made it even more ideological. So this is a guy who unveiled his net neutrality policy at FreedomWorks. This is a guy who rolled out his detailed plan yesterday in a sort of a closed circuit sort of appearance at the Heritage Foundation. He's basically, he was on NPR today, but otherwise all of his interviews have been Fox News straight through. And that's the kind of operation he's running. I mean, he spent a good 5 minutes of his speech announcing he was going to go after net neutrality, sort of attacking my group and trying to red bait us because one of our founders, Bob McChesney, you know, once talked about socialism in a Canadian magazine or something. And it was like 5 minutes of an FCC chairman's speech talking about internet policy. So that's sort of how he has approached the job and the kind of agenda he has tried to push. I think that, there are other ways you could have done it. They wouldn't have necessarily been better, but, most FCC chairs have this sort of generally pro-corporate approach, but he's really gone to the extreme. So in his proposal that'll dismantle net neutrality, it really erases everything that the Obama administration did that was good. It completely gets rid of the rules. So it doesn't even pretend that the FCC would step in if there was blocking, throttling, discrimination. It actually encourages paid prioritization. It encourages companies to build fast lanes where they favor their own content or somebody else's. And it gets rid of this really important thing that we fought for in 2015, which is called Title II. Title II is just part of the Communications Act, but it's under that part of the law is what gives the FCC the authority to actually step in when there's a problem. It happens to also give them the authority to do a lot of other things like protect your privacy and subsidize low-income families' broadband subscriptions and a whole bunch of other things that come out of that law. And Ajit Pai is basically saying this doesn't apply to the internet anymore. So he's just gone absolutely scorched earth with his approach. They've even added a few new exciting wrinkles, like they went out of their way to say that states can't step in and fill in the gaps. So if the FCC gets rid of net neutrality, they're trying to preempt the ability of states to actually step in and say, well, we're California, we want net neutrality. And that was a direct request, again, from the telecom industry, because when they got privacy rules stripped out by this Republican Congress, a bunch of states said, wait a minute, we want privacy, we're going to pass laws. So now they're trying to get all of that shot down. So basically top to bottom, and we just posted a piece at freepress.net. We went through all 210 pages of the order today, and it is just riddled with this kind of, flimsy logic and sort of outlandish legal claims and bogus research. They relied on all the right-wing think tanks to basically say, well, you get rid of regulations and the internet will thrive, full stop. And hey, we're going to count on transparency to do the job of stepping in if there's a problem. But if there actually is a problem, we're not going to do anything about it. This is basically the position this FCC is taking. And that's why people are so mad about it. And, even as someone who's I've been working on net neutrality since 2005. We've been through our ups and downs in this fight. But, we went through some of those really big days of activism. But just yesterday, when this rule got announced, 200,000 people called Congress in a 24-hour period about net neutrality. And it wasn't like the pump had been primed for week after week. People were really, it was trending on Twitter worldwide. Hundreds of people were announcing that they wanted to now participate in protests in a couple of weeks. So we're seeing a moment where the country again is really waking up to this threat, and they're really mad about it. And that's beginning to shift the politics again on this issue.
Yes. Now, I want to talk about the potential court challenge, which is where you think this thing is going. But before we get to that, let's talk about the timeline for the next couple of weeks, because there are these actions on December 7th. I know that some groups here in Los Angeles are doing something as soon as Tuesday on the 28th. And Eleanor, you're participating in actions, as are you, Craig, directly on the 14th at the FCC headquarters. So why don't you talk about what you want people to do? I know a lot of people were contacting the FCC today. I posted that I didn't think they were the most effective ones to contact because they tend to vote on party lines, that maybe we should be contacting Congress. And I know that that's what Evan Greer's group, Fight for the Future, they have a fantastic website called battleforthenet.com, where I think they connect you directly to your Congress member. So let's talk about the timeline and what you have planned for the next 2 weeks.
Yeah, there's a huge amount of energy now, which is great. We do want people calling Congress. Congress could step in. They have oversight of the FCC. They could rein this in. And we know this is going to be a political fight. So it matters that people who are actually elected are hearing from their representatives. I would advocate for an all of the above strategy. Like, I think it's great for the FCC to hear from people too. And we know from successful strategies we were all part of last time around that a lot of calls to the FCC make that really hard for them to do their jobs. So start with Congress. If you've got some extra energy, go ahead and give especially the Republican FCC commissioners a call and Ajit Pai a call. I'm sure he'd love to hear from you. And I think, there's a real moment here to really raise up the profile. And there's a huge coalition coalescing again So Battle for the Net, which is a collaboration between Fight for the Future, Demand Progress, and Free Press. We've been sort of behind some of these big days of action, but there are hundreds of groups involved. We've asked people to look at December 7th as a day where we're organizing protests at Verizon stores. Ajit Pai used to work for Verizon, and they've been one of the companies pushing hardest for this. So I believe there are more than 200 events being organized all across the country happening on December 7th. If people want to go to their Verizon store before December 7th, that would be great. And I would say for those, I see some comments popping up. People organizing things, definitely get in touch. One of the great things about this campaign is that so many of the groups that have been involved are constantly sharing information, talking, figuring out how we can support each other, send people to each other's events. And this will all build up to a big protest on December 14th at the FCC that the Voices for Internet Freedom is taking the lead on, which is another coalition that includes Free Press, Center for Media Justice, Color of Change, the National Hispanic Media Coalition, 18 Million Rising, and lots of others. And I know Popular Resistance is going to be part of that, as well as I imagine doing some other things all that week leading up to the vote. So there's a huge amount of activism and energy happening, and we want to channel that toward the FCC. I think you'll see some other things happen that maybe we're not quite ready to announce yet, but that will be going on all week to draw attention to this and really, leave no question that the FCC is on the wrong side here and going against the American public. We got 4 million comments in 2014. This year there were 22 million comments filed at the FCC, and the ones that weren't put in by bots, 95% of them go against Ajit Pai. So we want to demonstrate that. That's part of our court case too, showing just how out of touch this administration is with what the public it's supposed to serve actually wants.
So maybe you can talk about, just to give people a little micro view of what Popular Resistance is doing to plan for this. And also anybody who's watching that may want to do their own action, because you're a very experienced organizer, Eleanor, what tips would you give to people to have a successful action if they want to do something locally?
So also to piggyback on the 7th, even though I'm not personally organizing those protests with Fight for the Future, another thing that they're doing is when everybody's gathered at the Verizon stores, they will be reaching out to their members of Congress en masse. So that will be another way to flood Congress with these comments about how important net neutrality is. So that will also be happening on the 7th. And as Craig mentioned, there will be actions happening the entire week of December 14th as well. And although there aren't specifics that I can share at this particular point in time, are the Popular Resistance sort of goal in mind is to be specifically dealing with a direct action. So we will be doing something at the FCC in conjunction with what Craig was talking about. And people can sign up for that. I will put the little bit link in here as well, where people can sign up. This is a specific action that will be taking place in DC. But of course, Lauren, as you mentioned, people can, of course, just like you did, do sister actions if they have local FCC offices, or indeed, similar things that we saw with the online activism on that particular day, just like we saw with July 12th. People can join in online in that as well. And in terms of organizing a great action, I think that I'm sure that you have a lot of pointers on that as well. But I think just to have a specific goal in mind, like what are you trying to do with this action? Like with Verizon, we're trying to specifically make the tie between Ajit Pai and telecom communities, this concept of the revolving door at the FCC, and how the telecom companies are literally writing away the open internet, and also using that as a time to reach out to Congress once again. And as you mentioned, the Battle for the Net is a great tool to contact Congress directly. And with that, in terms of the goal, if your goal is to raise awareness, then even something as simple as standing outside of a business and letting people know that this is what's going on. And we've also flyered at metro stations during rush hour, letting people know where they can go to connect to their members of Congress. Putting it up on message boards, Reddit and things like that are very popular. And net neutrality is, of course, something that everyone online cares about because they're online. So I think that would really be what I would say is going forward is in terms of somebody just put up a message that says,
yes.
So Craig can probably explain this more, but in short terms, as I understand it, they can stop the FCC from voting on this.
Yeah, so the Congress has oversight authority of the FCC. So this is all about them putting political pressure on the FCC to back down. Ultimately, the FCC is an independent agency. They could defy Congress, but if especially Republicans feel like this is so unpopular that they don't want to be associated with it, especially as they're going in, speaking as a nonpartisan organization, going into an election year next year, we want to create a political environment in which they're just like, please just make net neutrality go away. We don't want to talk about it. The other thing to keep in mind is that we don't really want Congress to legislate. The laws on the books are really strong. The rules are clear. They were held up by the courts. So we don't want them to sort of get to interfere here, but we know that whatever the FCC does, there's going to be an effort by the cable and phone companies to basically, their strategy is a Jeep Pie passes something awful, then we run to Congress with something that's maybe 5% less awful and try to make it last forever by making it permanent. So we need Congress to be really aware here that that's not going to fly. And we need to both keep the Democrats who have not always been consistent net neutrality champions, imagine that, really, really strong and unified. And we know that when Democrats have no power, they're willing to be more bold. So we want to take advantage of that, get them, really locked in on this issue, and then let a lot of Republican members know where their constituents actually stand. And, somebody sent me the Breitbart.com article, and I really never recommend anybody go to Breitbart. But if you go there to read the net neutrality articles and you look in the comments, all the conservatives are like, what are you guys talking about? Net neutrality is a good thing. You look on Reddit today, and it's like net neutrality is the top item in like NASCAR chat groups. So it's really going across the political spectrum. And this is what we need to know that what Washington is doing. If you want to know where your member of Congress stands, battleforthenet.com, which is a site that Fight for the Future, Demand Progress, and Free Press we have a whole scorecard, and you can actually see whether or not your member of Congress has taken a stand on net neutrality. And I can not urge you to call enough, especially next week when they get back from Thanksgiving, although it's great to leave voicemails and things like that when they're gone. I mean, our office today was flooded with calls from Congress, from staff saying, can you please make the calls stop? Which is when you're having like a good action. And we're like, no, we don't, it's not a spigot. Like we don't turn on and off the calls. Those are your constituents. So that's the kind of level of noise. And we see that on healthcare, on so many other things. It has to reach that kind of fever pitch of popularity for these politicians to really, pay attention. Their instinct is to do what AT&T tells them to do.
This is probably going to go to court to overturn these, and it's going to go to the appellate court in D.C., which helped us in the past.
I think anything the FCC does, inevitably they get sued. And if they don't back off on this really horrible proposal that they unveiled today, then we're going to sue them. And we have had some success. We sued on the side of the FCC against Verizon. Actually, Verizon started it. They filed a lawsuit back in 2015, and we won. And so we were one of the groups that, got counsel and sort of became interveners in the case on behalf of the public interest groups. And we'll definitely do that again. Although in this case, we will likely be the ones suing the FCC, and probably with a lot of other people. Looking at the proposal they put out today, I feel pretty confident about our chances. It's really shoddy legal reasoning. It ignores all the available evidence. The lawyer's term would be arbitrary and capricious is a term in administrative law. No question that's part of what's going on here. And I think we have a good case, but it's still court. You never know exactly how it's going to shake out. In fact, the last net neutrality case that we won still could go all the way to the Supreme Court. We don't know. It's under consideration right now. So there's going to be kind of a legal mess. And that is actually partly why continuing the activist push is so important, because it's all about creating that political environment around even what a court is going to do and having clear demonstrations that this FCC ignored the public on their way in helps us in court. And frankly, especially when this gets tied up in court, and our friends in Congress start to get a little nervous, and some of those companies start to go to the table, having that political environment, them being afraid of what the public's going to do if they start cutting deals is going to be everything to keep them from, making a, sort of a compromise that's actually a capitulation.
Let's just go into the next subject, which I wanted to discuss, which is media cross ownership. I got into media when I graduated college in 1979 and started going to, media reform conferences in the 80s. And I remember then talking about media consolidation. And it's almost quaint when I think about that we felt that media was getting too consolidated in the 80s, because now here it is, 35 years later, and it's far worse. I mean, you have 5 companies owning all the media, and the cross ownership rules, which basically say that you can't own a television station and a newspaper in the same market. That's like one of the last things to be whittled away. And for instance, we have Tribune, which owns the LA Times. They also own KTLA. And Sinclair, which a lot of people are calling Trump TV, because believe it or not, it's actually more conservative than Fox News, if that's even possible, wants to merge with Tribune. And it looks like the FCC is going to allow this to happen. So can you talk a little bit about the cross ownership rules and media consolidation and what, if anything, we can do about this?
So yeah, Sinclair is trying to buy Tribune. Sinclair already owns 170 plus television stations all across the country. If they get this deal done, they'll be up at about 230 TV stations in the country, reaching 72% of the national audience. Now, supposedly there's a law in the books that says you can't own television stations reaching more than 39% of the national audience. But Sinclair is flouting that with the FCC's help. So ever since he got in office, Ajit Pai has been doing everything he can to try to do favors for Sinclair. So he's actually been changing a whole series of rules and regulations, and in some cases actually reinstating regulations, all for the benefit of this one company, which, as you mentioned, Lauren, essentially broadcast Trump propaganda, at least when it comes to their commentaries. There's fine journalists working at Sinclair stations, but they're actually forced to run sort of extreme right-wing commentaries from Armstrong Williams, who used to be Ben Carson's campaign manager, and this guy, Boris Epstein, who was a Trump campaign spokesman. They all work for Sinclair, and every Sinclair station has to run their content. So what the FCC is doing is they haven't approved this deal yet, although they're about to. They've absolutely cleared the way by gutting all of the existing media ownership regulations. So these are regulations that we've held in place since at least 1999, where there was Congress got involved in one of them a little bit later, but there have been a series of fights over attempts to loosen these rules. They've all failed, again, largely in the courts, where we sued the FCC along with some partners like Prometheus Radio Project and the Georgetown Law School, which helped with the lawyering. And part of the problem was they didn't do any of the research. They didn't listen to public input. They ignored the fact this was going to be devastating for the already abysmally low number of stations owned by women and people of color, and the rules were thrown out. Well, here comes Ajit Pai, and just last Thursday, he railroaded through a series of changes that would not only allow one company to own your newspaper, radio station, and a TV station in the same market, but the rules that Sinclair really cares about are limits that used to say you couldn't own 2 stations in the same small market. That's gone. There were rules that said you couldn't own 2 top-rated stations in the same market. Those aren't gone, but they basically said they'll review them on a case-by-case basis, and we know what that means. And they've also blessed all these deals that Sinclair has where they actually run the newsrooms of other stations. So what Pai is setting up is a situation where a company like Sinclair could control 2, 3, 4 television stations in a single community and really dominate obviously the advertising, but also do the same cookie cutter newscasts all on the same channel. And what you're going to see if he allows this to happen and he approves this merger is a whole nother wave of mergers, because then Rupert Murdoch's not going to think he has enough television stations. And Tegna, which used to be half of Gannett newspapers, they're going to think they don't have enough television stations. And so what is maybe 15 companies that are dominant, probably less now, 10 in the local television industry, is going to be whittled down to 4 or 5. So you're going to see incredible media concentration. And of course, this is disastrous for democracy. Local TV is still the #1 source for local news. Local TV plays an incredibly important role in local elections. And of course, that's how those guys make their money, is propping up the broken campaign finance system because they make so much money off of political ads. And that's what Sinclair specializes in. And there was a lot of reporting after the election that Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, essentially went before Republican bigwigs and said, oh, we had such a great deal with Sinclair to offer this uncut Trump content. And anytime you turn on Sinclair and they do national stories, it's either the terrorism alert desk, which is basically just an excuse to attack Muslims, or it's Republican talking points straight out of the White House that morning. So this is, really dangerous. Some of it's already been done, but of course, Ajit Pai being Ajit Pai, he's actually teed up that national ownership cap for December. The same meeting he's doing net neutrality, he's also starting the process to get rid of a national ownership cap, so that Sinclair doesn't have to sell any stations to make this deal go through. And this used to be a small company. Now they're the biggest broadcaster in the country, the #1 owner of affiliates in the country on almost every network. And they're about to move into Chicago. They're taking over WGN. They're moving into LA, as you talked about. They're moving into New York. And they're becoming really a national media powerhouse with an extreme conservative bent.
Well, this is how fascism gets started. And I don't mean to sound alarmist, but really, seriously, when you have somebody that is this right-wing ideological propaganda machine, and then you've got some guy like Trump in the White House, it's very concerning to me. And I don't really see the rest of, I don't see the rest of the activist community up in arms about this. I mean, I've seen emails from you guys at Free Press. But are you trying to organize?
Sure, yeah, and I think there's going to be a lot of pushback against Sinclair and groups like Common Cause. There's a group called Allied Progress that's been very active. A lot of the unions are very concerned about Sinclair. The problem with these media ownership changes is that they rush them through in 3 weeks. They use some legal maneuvering to essentially take a challenge to old rules to completely wipe the slate, and so there wasn't a lot of time for people to organize with everything else going on. That said, of course, once again, we're going to court. We're going to be filing a lawsuit in the next couple of weeks. There's one lawsuit already moving on some of the earlier rules. So it's not the end of this fight, but it is going to be a big one. And at some point, this too probably will end up in Congress because they supposedly are the ones who will have to ultimately change this national ownership cap if they want. So I think you're going to see a lot more coverage. Mother Jones actually has a fantastic piece out. I believe it's in this month's issue, really going over the whole sordid history of Sinclair as a company and their power grab. And that's definitely worth reading. And I think you'll see a lot more. I know we're trying to bring on an organizer right now to specifically work on Sinclair. And we'll both be putting pressure on this deal, but then also sounding the alarm as we go into the next electoral cycle, because people are going to really need to be watching this company and what they're going to try to do to, influence the outcome of future elections.
Yes, and I just put your website up there because, you're one of the few nonprofits that doesn't keep sending us fundraising emails. But you really
I can't promise that'll be true in December, but we'll do our best.
Now, I really want to encourage my viewers to make a contribution to Free Press because they are, as I started the show by saying, the preeminent media reform group in this country. And also Fight for the Future has done a great job on the net neutrality issue. I want to just finish the final subject that I want to talk about is the AT&T Time Warner merger, because Trump is getting a lot of heat for this on the mainstream corporate media. I was telling you in the pre-interview that I watched Ari Melber basically poo-poo this as a monopoly issue. And said, he tried to imply, well, he didn't try to imply, he out and out said that the reason Jeff Sessions' Justice Department was opposing this merger of AT&T and Time Warner is because of CNN and all the negative coverage that they've given Trump. When in fact, we stopped the Time Warner Comcast merger. I remember Purge campaign called everybody to testify at the California Public Utilities Commission because they had to sign off on it. And there I was testifying against this big merger, and we were able to stop that. And yet now, a couple years later, down the pike comes another equally bad merger. Can you tell us about about this, and also your comments, as you told me earlier, about the justice.
Yeah, sure. So this is a really bad merger, and it should be stopped. So I want to be clear about that. I think there are also, at the same time, really big concerns about Donald Trump and press freedom. And it is, frankly, it is suspicious that, you have one part of the Trump administration, the FCC, absolutely rolling out the red carpet for Sinclair to supersize, attacking net neutrality, which literally allows AT&T to undermine competition. And then you've got the Department of Justice, which admittedly has better lawyers, but you have the Department of Justice saying, no, wait a minute, this deal is completely anti-competitive. But the thing is, they're right. The Department of Justice is right. AT&T and Time Warner is a really bad idea because you've got AT&T, a huge company. I mean, literally, when you think monopoly and antitrust in America, AT&T is the poster child for this. They've been, reforming themselves since they were broken up in the 80s, and now they're, the number 1 or 2 wireless phone provider. They have their own, internet service and sort of cable service. They just were allowed to merge with DirecTV, which is the largest video, multi-channel video provider in the whole country. AT&T owns DirecTV, and now what AT&T wants is a bunch of cable channels, because that's what Time Warner owns. So they've split off from Time Warner Cable now, so it's all gets confusing because they've all moved around so much. But Time Warner, so they own CNN, they own TNT, TBS, HBO, which is probably the real crown jewel in this merger. And so the career Justice Department lawyers are looking at this and they're saying, wait a minute, if AT&T is allowed to control all this content, they're going to raise prices on everybody, because they're going to be able to hold other cable networks basically hostage if they want the quality programming, and they're just moving they're moving the money from one pocket to another. And we just experienced the Comcast NBC merger, which was a smaller merger, hard to believe, but similar, and it's been a disaster. And it hasn't been able to, prices continue to go up, of course, and all the conditions they put on the merger didn't work. So what the new head of the antitrust department has said, behavioral conditions don't work. You need to break this up. So AT&T, either you sell all the Turner cable channels, which includes CNN, but also TBS, TNT, and others, or you get rid of DirecTV or no deal. And what gives me some confidence that it's legit is I read the lawsuit, and they make a really strong case, including using AT&T's words against it. The problem is Donald Trump is screwing it up, because Donald Trump, with all of his bluster, with all of his tweets, with all of his direct attacks on media for trying to hold him accountable at all, he actually problematizes the case, because now AT&T can go to court and say, look, they're just doing this to publish CNN, and AT&T gets to present themselves as this First Amendment advocate to all these journalists, like, oh, we're just here defending CNN, when no, they're just here being greedy. So we have to, when we approach this one, hold 2 ideas in our head at the same time, which is don't trust Donald Trump, and also don't trust AT&T. And when they happen to be at odds, take advantage of it.
All right. Well, we've come to the end of our show, and I want to thank both of my guests for being here. But is there anything you'd like to add before we say goodbye, Eleanor?
So protectourinternet.org is the home of Popular Resistance's specific net neutrality fight. So you can go there to find more information on the things that we have planned and the things that we're doing.
Great. So thank you, Eleanor. Thank you, Craig. I guess Madeline Merritt already put the information about Tuesday's net neutrality protest in the comments, but I will be actually speaking at that one as well as live streaming from there. So as I end all my shows, keep fighting.